Ted Miller woke up at 6:30 that Tuesday morning, as usual, without an alarm clock because his body had been on a strict schedule for years, and he lay in bed, looking at the ceiling of their suburban Detroit bedroom, where the fine cracks reminded him of the day he and Melissa had bought the house 20 years ago, full of hopes and plans for a future with children. He turned to face his wife. Melissa was asleep, her blonde hair spread out on the pillow, her face calm, without those little lines that appeared when she frowned, thinking about household chores. She looked much the same as she had on their wedding day, an intelligent, caring woman who always knew how to support him in difficult times. Ted got up quietly, put on his usual khakis and a light blue shirt, went down to the kitchen and turned on the old coffee maker, which, despite its age, still worked, and he saw no reason to replace it with a new one. While the coffee brewed, he looked out the window at the backyard. The grass was overgrown, but he decided to save the mowing for the weekend, when his oldest son, Brad, would be home from college, and they could do it together like they used to. Melissa came down half an hour later, wearing her favorite gray robe that he had given her for her birthday a few years ago, and they ate oatmeal with berries, talking about the day. She was going to the supermarket to buy groceries for dinner, and he had college lectures and an annual physical in the afternoon. "Don't forget to take the results of the tests we took," Melissa said, pouring herself some coffee and sitting down at the table, her voice soft, with that familiar concern that always warmed Ted. "Already in the bag," he replied, stirring a spoonful of sugar in his cup, just one, as always, because he was careful about his health, though not fanatically. "The doctor said it was nothing serious, just a checkup. Okay, just be careful on the road, there's construction on the highway again," she added, looking at him warmly, and Ted thought how lucky he was to have a wife who remembered such little things and always put her family above all else. They kissed at the door, and Ted climbed into his Honda, which had 150,000 miles on it and was still reliable, and drove to the college where he taught American history to freshmen. The morning had been typical, a lecture on the Civil War, where he explained the economic causes of the conflict, and the students asked questions, sometimes simple ones, but he answered patiently, believing that his job was to develop thinking as well as teach facts. He ate a sandwich in the cafeteria during the break, chatted with a colleague about a faculty meeting, and thought about his children. Brad was studying in Chicago, Mary worked in an office downtown, and the youngest, William, had just graduated from high school and was preparing for college. They were good kids, and Ted was proud of them, although sometimes he worried that he had not given them more, but Melissa had always said that the main thing was love and support. After lunch, Ted drove to the clinic, 10 minutes from the college, a modern building with large windows and a full parking lot. He checked in, submitted his insurance, and sat in the waiting room, leafing through a travel magazine, although he had no plans to go anywhere. His budget was tight and Melissa liked to relax at home. 20 minutes later, he was called in. Instead of the usual Dr. Harris, there was a young woman in her 30s with short dark hair and a white coat. Her name tag read, Dr. Emily Wright. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," she said, smiling professionally as she sat down at her computer. "I'm Dr. Wright, filling in for Dr. Harris. Let's take a look at your chart." Ted nodded and sat down, feeling a little awkward, as he always did at these checkups. It was routine, blood pressure, tests, questions about how he was feeling. She clicked the mouse, scrolling through the screen, and he looked at the healthy eating poster on the wall. "You have 3 children, right?" she asked, without looking up from the monitor. "Yes, 2 adults and 1 teenager," Ted answered. "Okay," she continued, "and in terms of family history. Wait, it says here, you've been infertile since birth, right? Does that affect anything now?" The words hit him like thunder. Ted froze, his heart pounding, trying to process what he'd just heard. Infertility, he had 3 children. He remembered every pregnancy Melissa had had, the births, Brad's first steps, Mary's, William's. It couldn't be true. "What did you say?" he asked again, his voice trembling and muffled. Dr. Wright looked up, her face changing as she realized she had made a mistake. "Sorry, this is from an old recording, maybe there's a mix-up," she said quickly. Let me clarify. But Ted knew it wasn't confusion. Her tone betrayed the truth. He sat staring at the floor as she leafed through the notes, and a tension built inside him, quiet but heavy, as if his life was falling apart. She continued her examination, taking his blood pressure, listening to his heart, but he responded mechanically, his mind spinning around her words. Infertility since birth, so the children weren't his. Melissa cheated on him. The thought was unbearable, but it was in his head, and he couldn't shake it. Everything all right, Mr. Miller? Dr. Wright asked, noticing his paleness. The pressure is a little high, but nothing to worry about. Yeah, fine, he lied, though inside he was seething. Can I have a copy of my medical records? The full one. She nodded, although she hesitated for a second. Of course, I'll print it. Wait. She left, and Ted was alone. His hands were shaking, and he looked at the wedding ring he had worn for 25 years and thought about trust, how it took years to build, and then one moment to break. If that was true, then everything he knew about his family was a lie. He remembered the children's faces. Brad, serious like himself, Mary, practical like his mother, William, a dreamy teenager. But now every image seemed in doubt. The doctor came back, handed him a sheaf of papers, and he signed the form without looking and left. In the parking lot, he got into his car, but didn't drive home. He couldn't look at Melissa now without knowing the truth. Instead, he headed to the city park where they sometimes walked on weekends. It was quiet today, a couple of people with dogs, children on the playground. Ted parked by the lake, picked up the papers, and sat on a bench under an old oak tree. Leafing through the archive, he found the record from a youth examination. Congenital infertility, low sperm count, 0 chance of conception. He read it over and over, his mind refusing to accept it. It meant that Brad, Mary, William were not his. Melissa had cheated on him, perhaps more than once. A voice inside him said, "How could she? We were happy. Or I thought we were. Maybe there was a mistake in the tests. But 3 children is not a coincidence. Who is their father? Why did she keep quiet?" He sat for an hour, watching the ducks in the lake, thinking about the crisis in their marriage. He and Melissa had been through a lot. Financial difficulties, moving, raising children. But now he saw the signs he had previously ignored. Her frequent trips to visit friends, the long phone calls she took in another room. Maybe it was for a reason. Age was also weighing on him. At 48, he had felt tired of the routine, which he thought was normal, but now he was unsure. Family responsibilities had always been important to him. He had worked to provide for his wife and children, supported Melissa when she left her job as a nurse. And now, the choice was agonizing. Find out the truth or keep the peace in the family. He did not know the answer, and this tension, quiet and viscous, was growing inside him. The sun was setting, and Ted knew it was time to go, but not home. He called Melissa from the parking lot. "I'll be late at work, urgent papers," he said, trying to sound calm. "Okay, honey, dinner can wait." "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft as always. "Yes, everything is fine," he lied again, feeling guilty but unable to tell the truth. He drove to a cafe on the outskirts of town, an old place with wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, spreading out his papers, but he didn't read, he just thought. His inner monologue kept going. What if the kids find out? It will destroy them. Brad is building a career. Mary is getting ready for her wedding. William is still a child. But is it right to live a lie? Trust is the foundation of marriage, and now it is gone. He remembered how he met Melissa. She was a nurse at the hospital where he was treated for appendicitis. Her care attracted him. They quickly married because they loved each other. Or did he love? Maybe she was looking for stability. In American society, family is a value. Divorces happen. But in their circle, among church friends and colleagues, everyone tried to save the marriage. To forgive or not? He didn't know. A man his age came into the cafe, ordered a beer, and was talking on the phone, probably to his wife, his voice warm, confidential. It cut Ted. He thought about personal growth. Maybe this was a chance to understand himself, but right now it seemed distant. The coffee got cold, he paid, and drove home when it got dark. Melissa was waiting with dinner-baked chicken with vegetables, her signature dish. Mary had dropped by for a visit. William was sitting with the phone. "Dad, you're late," William said, looking up from the screen. "Work," Ted replied, forcing a smile. They ate while discussing the day. Mary talked about her job in marketing. William complained about school tests. Melissa asked about her physical health. "Is everything okay?" Her voice was caring. "Yes, routine," he said, avoiding her gaze, thinking, how can she pretend? Or is she not pretending? After dinner, the kids left and Ted and Melissa sat in the living room watching TV. She laid her head on his shoulder and he tensed but didn't move away. "You're quiet today," she noticed. "Is something wrong?" "I'm just tired," he answered, and it was half the truth. He lay awake that night, listening to her breathing, thinking about the betrayal that changes even memories. In the morning he got up, made coffee, but couldn't eat. At work, the day passed in a fog. Lectures, students, but thoughts were on the map. At lunchtime, he called the lab where they did the old tests. They confirmed infertility, no mistakes. It was final. In the evening, when he returned, he saw Melissa in the garden, watering the flowers, and thought about the choice, to speak or to remain silent. For now, he chose silence, but the tension grew, viscous, like his whole life now. Ted Miller drove home from work on a Wednesday night, his Honda chugging along suburban streets where the streetlights were already on, casting a soft yellow glow over the neat lawns of his neighbors. He hadn't turned on the radio as he usually did, because the silence allowed his thoughts to swirl in his head, and they were heavy, like stones he couldn't shake off. Yesterday at the clinic, Doctor writes words about infertility. The medical chart he'd hidden in a drawer in his college desk, all of it hung there. He tried to focus on the road, on the familiar turns, on the smell of the autumn air that drifted through the cracked window, but his mind kept returning to the same thought. Were Brad, Mary, William his children or not? He remembered their faces, their habits, their laughter, but now each image was clouded with doubt, like a photograph that had been held up to the light too long and was beginning to fade. The house greeted him with warmth and the smell of fried fish. Melissa was cooking dinner, and he heard her humming in the kitchen, an old tune they used to listen to in the early years of their marriage, when they would dance at college parties. Ted paused in the hallway, hung his jacket on the coat rack, and looked at himself in the mirror by the door. His face was tired, the lines around his eyes were deeper than he remembered, the hair at his temples grayer than he had noticed before. He was an ordinary man, not too tall, not too strong, with kind eyes, as Melissa said. But now he looked at his reflection and wondered, is there something in me that I have passed on to them? Or have I just been kidding myself all these years? "Ted, are you home?" Melissa called from the kitchen, her voice as warm and familiar as ever, but now it cut like a knife. "Yes, just dropped by," he said, trying to sound even, and walked into the living room, where on the mantel above the fireplace stood their family photographs, neatly arranged in frames that Melissa had picked out in antique stores because she loved things with a story. He stopped in front of the shelf, and his gaze fell on a picture taken 10 years ago on Lake Michigan. The four of them, he, Melissa, Brad, and Mary, then still teenagers, and William, a baby, sitting on his shoulders, laughing and waving his arms. Ted took the picture and ran his finger along the glass, trying to see his features in the children's faces. Brad, tall, with a serious look, had always looked like him, or so it seemed to him. The same straight nose, the same stubborn chin. Mary, with her blonde hair and quick movements, reminded him of Melissa, but wasn't her smile his? And William, with his dark eyes and his habit of thoughtfully tugging at his hair, was that from him, or did he just want to believe it? He put the picture back and took another, an older one, from their wedding. He in a formal suit, Melissa in a simple white dress. They were young, happy, and he remembered how Mary was born 7 months after the wedding. The doctors had said she was premature, slightly underweight, but healthy. Ted hadn't asked questions, too happy, too busy being a new father. Now he was counting in his head, 7 months. Was that possible? Or was this the first sign he'd missed? "Dinner's ready," Melissa called, and Ted jerked back to reality. He put the frame back and went into the kitchen, where the table was set: fried tilapia, mashed potatoes, cucumber, and tomato salad. Melissa was standing at the stove, wearing jeans and a blue blouse, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail, looking the same as always, caring, confident, his wife. But now he looked at her differently, searching her movements, her eyes for something that might give away the secret. "How was your day?" she asked, placing a plate in front of him and sitting down opposite him. "The students haven't been a pain in the ass?" "No, it's the same old thing," he said, looking down at his plate to avoid meeting her eyes. "A lecture on Reconstruction after the Civil War. They sleep more than they listen." She smiled, and that smile, so familiar, now seemed alien to him. "Well, you always had a way of stirring them up," she said, stabbing a piece of fish. "Remember when Brad wrote an essay on Lincoln in school? You were so proud that he quoted your lecture." Ted nodded, but the mention of Brad stung. He remembered helping his son with that essay, sitting at this same table discussing historical facts, Brad looking up to him as if he knew the answers. But now Ted wondered, if he's not my son, why does he look so much like me? Or is it just a coincidence? He ate in silence, listening to Melissa talk about her day. She'd gone to a book club with her friends, discussing a novel she hadn't particularly liked, but she'd gone anyway because it was an excuse to get out of the house. After dinner, Melissa suggested watching a movie, but Ted said he had some student papers to grade and went into his office on the second floor, a small nook with bookshelves and an old wooden desk where he kept his notes and history books. He closed the door, sat down, and pulled a medical chart out of a drawer, but didn't open it. Instead, he pulled out an old photo album Melissa had made when the kids were little. He flipped through the pages, pausing at each picture: Brad on his bike at age 5, Mary at the school play dressed as an angel, William in the sandbox with a shovel in his hand. He looked for his features, his gestures, but the longer he looked, the more he doubted them. Brad was tall like him, but her eyes, whose were they? Mary smiled like Melissa, but her forehead, her cheekbones, whose? William was darker than he and Melissa, but Ted had always thought it was from his mother, who had Italian roots. Now he was not sure of anything. His thoughts went back to Mary, to her birth. 7 months after the wedding. He remembered Melissa announcing the pregnancy a couple of months after the wedding, how excited they had been, even though it had been unexpected. The doctors had said that premature babies were normal, especially for a first pregnancy, and Ted had accepted that without question. He had been young, in love, and had trusted her completely. But now he counted in his mind 7 months. Too fast, unless he pushed the thought away, but it kept coming back like an insistent knock on the door. If Mary wasn't his daughter, then who was her father? And Brad, and William too. He remembered Melissa sometimes going away for the weekend to visit her parents in the early years of their marriage, returning tired but happy. He had thought it was just family stuff then, but now every episode seemed suspicious. Ted closed the sketchbook and leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension tighten in his chest. He thought about trust, how it had been the foundation of their marriage, how he had never doubted Melissa, even when they had fought about money or raising their children. But now that trust was broken, and he didn't know how to move on. He imagined asking her point blank, "Did you cheat on me? Whose kids are these?" But what if she confessed, or lied, and how would that affect the kids? Brad was just starting a career in Chicago. Mary was planning her wedding. William was getting ready for college. They were his family, his purpose, and the thought of them not being his was unbearable. He came downstairs where Melissa was watching TV, comfortably settled on the sofa with a cup of tea. She looked at him and smiled. "Finished with your work? Want to watch something together?" "No, I think I'll go to bed," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I'm tired." "Okay, rest," she replied, and there was nothing unusual in her voice, but Ted was now looking for hidden meaning in every word she said. He went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. He lay there listening to Melissa brush her teeth in the bathroom and thought about betrayal, how it changed everything, even the memories that had seemed so safe. He remembered holding Mary in his arms in the hospital, the way she looked at him with those big eyes, and he felt like a father. But now he wondered, was he a father to her, or to Brad, or to William? He thought about social expectations. In their circle, among church friends and colleagues, family was sacred, and divorce was considered a last resort. But how to live with that truth? Or how to live without knowing the truth? The next day, Ted decided to take a break and drove downtown to the History Museum, where he sometimes spent time when he needed to think. The museum was small, with exhibits about 19th century Detroit, and it was quiet, with only a few tourists wandering the halls. Ted walked among the display cases, reading the plaques about the early settlers, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the crisis in their marriage, about how age changed people. At 48, he didn't feel old, but he felt tired, as if life had become harder than he had expected. He thought about Melissa. She had changed too, becoming quieter, talking less about herself, more about the children, about the house. Was this a sign of guilt, or just the natural course of life? At the museum, he noticed an older couple holding hands, looking at an old map of the city. They were talking quietly, and Ted heard the woman say, "We've been through a lot, but we've stayed together." It made him think about personal growth. Maybe this crisis was a chance to become better, to understand himself, to understand Melissa. But how, if the foundation of their lives was a lie? He left the museum and sat on a bench near the entrance, watching the cars go by. The internal monologue continued. If I take a DNA test, what will it do? If they're not mine, I'll lose them. If they are mine, I'll live with the doubt that I was wrong. And Melissa, how could she hide this? Or did she not know? He returned home that evening, and Melissa suggested they go for the weekend to her mother's nursing home, an hour outside the city. Ted agreed because he didn't want to arouse suspicion, but he was silent on the drive. They talked about the weather, about their plans for Christmas, but his mind was elsewhere. At the nursing home, Melissa's mother, Mrs. Johnson, greeted them with a smile. They drank tea, and she recalled old stories. "You were always such a good couple," she said, looking at them. "Just like when you were young." Ted nodded, but inside he was thinking, was it true? He looked at Melissa, who was laughing at her mother's joke, and searched her face for answers, but he saw only the familiar woman he loved. On the way back, he couldn't resist and asked, "Do you remember when Mary was born?" 7 months, it was so fast. Melissa looked at him, frowning slightly. "Yes, she was premature, but everything turned out okay." "Why do you ask?" "I just remembered," he said, and fell silent, feeling the tension grow. At home, he looked at the photographs again, comparing, analyzing, and thinking about the choice, truth or peace. For now, he had chosen silence, but every day it became harder, and his life, so familiar, now seemed alien. Ted Miller sat in his office at college on a Friday afternoon, after classes had ended and the students had filed out of the building, leaving it mostly empty. It was drizzling outside, and the raindrops trickled down the glass in blurry patterns that he followed automatically with his eyes, his mind wandering far from his lecture notes and undergraduate essays. There was a stack of ungraded papers on the desk in front of him, but he couldn't bring himself to do anything about them. Instead, he pulled out an old notebook from his bag where he had jotted down family notes years ago. His children's birth dates, their first words, important events. He flipped through the pages, and each entry Brad saying "Daddy" at 10 months, Mary walking at 1, William enjoying drawing at 3 seemed less like a memory than a clue he should have noticed sooner. His fingers stopped on the entry. Mary, born February 15, 1998, 7 months after their wedding. He closed the book, put it aside, and rubbed his temples, feeling how the headache that had started in the morning was getting worse. Ted stood up and went to the window, looking out at the wet campus where a few students were running under umbrellas toward the dorms. He thought about Melissa, about those first years of their marriage, when they were young and full of hope. They had married quickly, a year after they met, and he had never doubted her, even when conception had not happened right away. They had tried for more than a year, and he remembered Melissa sometimes crying at night, thinking he was asleep, and him holding her and telling her it would be okay, that they were young, that there was time. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't suggested doctors, because he trusted her, trusted their love, their future. "It will come when it comes," she had said, and he had agreed because he didn't want to push it. And then, after she had visited a farm with friends in Wisconsin, she had come back with the news, "I'm pregnant." It was like a miracle, and Ted was so happy that he didn't ask why so suddenly, why after that trip. He just accepted it, held her hand in the hospital when Mary was born, and thought that their life was finally complete. Now he stood by the window and replayed those days in his head, like an old movie he'd seen 1,000 times, only now noticing details that had eluded him before. That trip to the farm, it had been 3 weeks longer than usual. Melissa had said she needed to rest, that the fresh air would do her good, and he'd agreed because she looked tired and he wanted her to be happy. When she came back, her cheeks were rosy, her eyes were bright, and a month later she'd announced she was pregnant. Ted hadn't wondered then, hadn't asked who she'd been with, what she'd been doing. He'd trusted her. But now he wondered who had been on that farm. Friends he barely knew? Someone else? And why had they never talked about the doctors, the tests, the inability to conceive? He'd always assumed it was just nature, that all couples had difficulties. But now he knew the truth, or at least part of the truth, from his medical records. He couldn't have children. Never could. Ted returned to his desk, sat down, and opened his laptop, but instead of working, he began searching for information on infertility. He read articles on medical websites about how men sometimes didn't know they couldn't conceive, how couples lived for years without getting tested because it felt personal, shameful. He came across a forum where people were discussing their stories, and one line stuck with him. "I trusted her, but she knew the truth and kept quiet." It was like a punch in the chest. He closed the laptop, feeling something new boiling inside him, not anger, but something colder, sharper, mistrust. For the first time in 25 years of marriage, he looked at Melissa not as a wife, but as someone who could hide a lifetime from him. He remembered Brad, their second child. They hadn't planned on having another baby after Mary, but 2 years later Melissa was pregnant again. Ted had been busy with his new job at college, and they'd just bought a house, and he hadn't noticed how she'd changed in those months. She'd often visited her sister in Cleveland, said she was helping with her nephews, and he'd never asked for details because he'd been so busy with his own things. When Brad was born, Ted hadn't asked again. He was happy that their family was growing. And William, their youngest, had arrived 5 years later after another trip Melissa had made, this time to visit a friend in Chicago. Ted had joked that her travels brought her good luck, but now the joke seemed bitter. Why had he never asked? Because he trusted her, because he loved her, because he didn't want to see anything but their perfect life. He gathered his things and left the office, deciding not to go straight home. Instead, he went to a small bar on the edge of town, not the same one he had frequented before, but a quiet, wood-paneled, whiskey-scented place where people his age usually gathered to drink beer and watch baseball. Ted didn't drink alcohol. He ordered a soda and sat in the corner, watching the other patrons. Behind the bar, a man in his 50s was talking to the bartender about his daughter, who had just started college, and his voice was full of pride. Ted looked at him and wondered, does he really know that she's his daughter? Or does he just trust her too? The thought was new, foreign, and it scared him, because he had never been a suspicious person. He had always been someone who saw the good in people, who believed in honesty. But now that faith was crumbling, and he felt lost. The bar was warm, but Ted felt cold inside. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos. Brad at graduation, tall and smiling broadly. Mary on her first day at the office in a suit. He looked for himself in their faces, but now he saw only questions. He remembered how once, when Mary was about 10, she had asked, "Dad, why do I have blue eyes when you and Mom have brown?" He had laughed, said something about grandparents, but now the question sounded like an accusation in his head. He never checked, never asked, never probed. "Because he trusted me." Ted finished his soda and drove home, but not before stopping at a bookstore to buy something to distract himself. He wandered the shelves, looking at the covers, but nothing caught his attention. He ended up picking up a book about the psychology of family relationships, not because he wanted to read it, but because he thought it might provide answers. When he got home, Melissa met him in the living room, knitting, a hobby she had picked up a couple of years ago to keep her hands occupied when her children were home. "You're late," she said, without looking up from her knitting needles. "Were you held up at work?" "Yeah, I was checking my essay," he lied, putting his bag down. "Then I stopped by the store." "Did you buy anything interesting?" she asked, and her voice was so ordinary, so familiar, that Ted almost felt guilty for his thoughts. "Just a book," he answered without elaborating, and went into the kitchen to pour himself some water. It was a quiet dinner, just the two of them, because Mary was meeting her fiancé, William was at a friend's house, and Brad was in Chicago. Melissa told him about her day. She had gone to a church sorority meeting. They were discussing a charity event. Ted listened, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at her hands, deftly slicing bread, and wondered, how could she have kept quiet for so long? Did she know about my infertility, or was she just taking advantage of it? He remembered how once, about 10 years ago, she had said she wanted to get tested to see why they had had trouble conceiving after Mary, but then changed her mind, saying she didn't want to spend the money. He had agreed because he saw no point in digging up the past. Now he regrets it. After dinner, Ted went to the garage where they kept old boxes of their stuff. He told Melissa he wanted to find his old notes, but he was really looking for anything that might give a clue. Old letters, photographs, journals. He found a box of their wedding cards and letters from friends, but nothing suspicious. Only one letter from Melissa's friend Linda from the farm in Wisconsin made him stop. Linda wrote, "It was so much fun, you should come visit more often. Jack asked about you." Who was Jack? Ted didn't remember Jack, but the name stuck in his head. He folded the letter back up, feeling the distrust growing, like a poison he couldn't stand any longer. Later, in bed, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the moral choice, to know the truth or live in ignorance. He had always chosen the latter because he trusted. But now that trust was gone, and he felt like a stranger in his own life. He thought about the children, how the truth could destroy their world, and about Melissa, who seemed as loving as ever. But now every look, every word she said, raised doubts. He decided that he would seek answers, but carefully, without destroying the family. Tomorrow he would talk to a friend, maybe ask for advice, but for now he was silent, and that silence was as heavy as his doubts. Ted Miller sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning when the house was unusually quiet. Melissa had gone to the market to buy fresh vegetables, and William, their youngest, was still asleep upstairs, as he usually did on weekends. On the table in front of Ted was a laptop, its screen glowing with a page from a website offering at-home DNA tests. He had found the site the night before, after a sleepless night of lying in the dark, listening to Melissa's even breathing and replaying in his mind all the moments in their lives that now seemed suspicious. The site promised confidentiality, quick results, and answers to questions about kinship. Ted hesitated, his finger hovering over the order button, because this step seemed irreversible, like a leap into the abyss. He knew that once he sent the test, he would no longer be able to pretend that nothing had changed. But the doubts that grew with each passing day were stronger than his fear. He entered his credit card information, selected Express Delivery, and clicked Confirm. The order was placed. Ted closed the laptop and felt his heart beat faster than usual. He stood up, went to the second-floor bathroom, and opened the cabinet where he kept the kids' old things. Toothbrushes, combs, the hair clips Mary had left behind when she went to her apartment. He took a plastic bag and carefully placed it inside Brad's old prom hairbrush, Mary's hair clip with the blonde strands still stuck in it, and William's hairbrush he'd forgotten in the bathroom a few months ago. He moved quickly but carefully, as if he were afraid Melissa would come back and catch him doing it. Then he went down to the living room, got a Q-tip, and carefully dabbed the drool out of his mouth, following the instructions he'd found on the website. He tucked it all into an envelope that he'd mail on Monday when he left for work. He tucked the envelope into his work bag, tucking it between his lecture folders, and felt both guilty and determined. It was the first step towards the truth, but he didn't know if he was ready for what it would bring. With no results coming in, Ted decided to dig deeper into the past. He started with what was at hand: old boxes in the basement that he and Melissa hadn't opened in years. The basement was cool and smelled of damp and old wood. There were shelves filled with tools, Christmas decorations, and boxes labeled personal effects and miscellaneous. Ted picked out a box labeled Melissa's old stuff, which she'd brought with her when they'd moved into the house. He sat down on an old chair, propped the box on his lap, and began sorting through the contents. Old letters, postcards, photographs, a few notebooks Melissa had kept when she was a nurse. He flipped through the pages, hoping to find something: a hint, a name, a date that might explain who had been with her 25 years ago when Mary was born. In one of the notebooks, he found notes from her shifts at the hospital where they had met. There were names of co-workers, notes on patients, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then he came across a photograph tucked between the pages: Melissa, young, in jeans and a sweater, standing next to a man Ted didn't recognize. They were smiling, with a barn behind them and a field in the background that looked like the ones he'd seen in the Wisconsin photos. On the back of the photograph was written, "Summer 1997, Linda's farm." Ted froze, looking at the man. He was tall, with dark hair and broad shoulders, his arm around Melissa's shoulder, and it looked too close to be a normal friend. Ted tried to remember if Melissa had mentioned anyone from that trip, but all he could remember was Linda, her friend, and a vague mention of a fun group. He put the photograph in his pocket, deciding not to show it to Melissa until he knew more. The next step was social media. Ted rarely went online except for work, but he knew Melissa was active on Facebook, where she shared garden photos, recipes, and the occasional family snapshot. He pulled up her profile on his laptop, feeling like a spy, and started scrolling through her old posts, starting with the earliest ones she'd posted back in 2008, when social media was just starting to gain popularity. There were photos of her kids, their trips, family gatherings, but nothing suspicious. So he decided to look for Linda, Melissa's friend whose farm was mentioned in the emails and in the photo. He found her profile: Linda Carter, a woman his age living in Wisconsin, with posts about her gardening business. Ted flipped through her old albums and found several photos from the farm. Melissa was in some of them, laughing, holding a glass of wine, with the same man in the photo next to her. His name, according to the signature, was David. Ted wrote the name down in the notebook he now carried with him and felt his stomach clench. David. Another name he didn't know. He remembered Melissa talking about the trip to the farm, but always in general terms. "We went for walks, had a barbecue, had fun." He'd never asked for details because he'd never seen the point. Now he wished he'd paid closer attention. He went back to the box and found an old journal Melissa had kept in 1997. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, mostly about work and wedding plans, but one entry caught his eye. "Feels alive. Wisconsin feels like another world. I want to remember every moment." No names, no details, but the tone of the entry was too personal, too emotional, for a simple trip to visit a friend. Ted closed the journal, feeling the mistrust that had begun a few days earlier turn into a certainty that Melissa was hiding something. That evening, when Melissa returned from the market, she was in a good mood, talking about fresh tomatoes and how she had met a neighbor who had invited them to a barbecue the following Saturday. Ted listened, nodding, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at her, trying to see in her face the young woman in the photograph who had stood next to David. Was she in love? Or was it just a fleeting moment? He didn't know, and that not knowing was the worst of it. "You seem thoughtful," Melissa noted, chopping vegetables for the salad. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, I'm just tired," he answered, as he had become accustomed to doing in recent days, and helped her set the table. Dinner passed quietly. William came down from his room, grumbling that he had exams to study for, but sat down to eat anyway. Ted looked at his son, at his dark hair and his habit of drumming his fingers on the table, and tried to remember if he had the same habit. He found nothing in common, and this only increased his doubts. After dinner, he asked Melissa to go for a walk, hoping that a private conversation would give him some clarity, but she declined, saying that she wanted to finish her knitting. Ted went out alone, walking through their quiet neighborhood, where the houses all looked alike, with neat lawns and American flags on the front porches. He thought about moral dilemmas. If a DNA test confirmed his worst fears, what would he do? A divorce at their age would be complicated: the house, the finances, the friends, the church where they were active members. And the kids, how would the truth affect them? Brad was building a career, Mary was getting ready to get married, William was just starting out as an adult. Ted stopped at a nearby park, sat on a bench, and looked at the stars, barely visible through the city lights. He thought about personal growth. Maybe this crisis was a chance to reinvent himself, to become stronger. But now he felt only pain and confusion. The next day, Sunday, they went to church as usual. Melissa sang in the choir, and Ted sat in the back row listening to the sermon on forgiveness and love. He looked at his wife, smiling as she talked with the other women after the service, and wondered, how can she be so calm? Does she know I'm digging, or has she long since moved on? After church, they stopped at a brunch place, and Ted watched Melissa as she ordered an omelet and chatted with the waitress about the weather. He tried to remember if she was always like this, open, kind, or was it a mask he didn't notice. That evening, he continued his search. He found Melissa's old phone, which she hadn't used in 5 years, and to his surprise, he was able to turn it on. There were old messages, mostly from friends and her sister, but one, from an unknown number, dated 2002, caught his attention. Miss those days on the farm. How are you? The sender was unsigned, but Ted wrote the number down in his notebook. He didn't know how to find the owner, but he figured he'd try again later, maybe through a coworker who was tech-savvy. The days leading up to the DNA results dragged on. Ted lived in constant tension, trying to act normal, but every conversation with Melissa, every glance at the children, heightened his internal conflict. He thought about the trust that had been the foundation of their marriage and how it had disappeared. He thought about family responsibilities, how he had always put his family first, and how that family now seemed alien to him. He thought about the choice. If the truth destroyed everything, could he forgive? Or would he rather live in ignorance, maintaining a fragile peace? As he waited, he continued to dig, like an archaeologist searching for answers in the dust of the past, but each new clue only pulled him deeper into doubt. Ted Miller was sitting in his college office when an email arrived from a DNA testing company. It was a Tuesday morning, and the rain outside had stopped, leaving a gray sky and puddles on the campus asphalt. He noticed the notification on his laptop screen, and his heart sank as if time had stopped. The email was short, with a subject line, "Results ready," and a link to a secure website. Ted closed the door to his office, even though the hallway was quiet. Class hadn't started yet, and entered the password he'd been given in the instructions. His fingers shook as he clicked the link, and the screen loaded with tables, graphs, and text that he couldn't make out at first because he was so nervous. He found the results section and began reading. The words on the screen were cold and clear, like a medical diagnosis. DNA analysis has ruled out a biological relationship between Ted Miller and Brad Miller. No markers match. Ted read it 3 times, hoping it was a mistake, that he had misunderstood, but the numbers and words remained unchanged. Brad, his oldest son, the one he had taught to ride a bike, the one he had discussed history with over dinner, the one he had been proud of in college, was not his son. He closed his laptop without turning it off and stared at the wall where the old Civil War poster he had put up to inspire his students hung. It seemed as alien to him now as his life. Ted didn't know how long he sat there, staring into space. His mind tried to process the truth, but it was too hard, too sharp. He remembered Brad as a child, building towers of blocks, looking at him earnestly when Ted told him about the Battle of Gettysburg, hugging him at graduation and saying, "Thank you for always being there, Dad." Those moments, which Ted had thought were the core of their connection, now seemed an illusion. He felt something breaking inside him, not loudly but quietly, like a crack in glass that slowly widened. He didn't cry, there were no tears, only emptiness mixed with something he couldn't name. Anger, hurt, betrayal, all of it. He hadn't told anyone, not even Melissa, who was making breakfast as usual this morning and asking if he'd forgotten about church on Friday. He'd nodded, mumbled something unintelligible, and left for work earlier than usual to avoid her gaze. Now, sitting in his office, he knew he couldn't talk to her until he sorted himself out. He didn't know how to look at her, how to ask, "Did you know? Were you cheating on me? Who's Brad's father?" The questions were swirling around in his head, but he wasn't ready to ask them. Not today. Maybe never. Ted got home late after stopping at a small store on the outskirts of town and buying a bottle of bourbon. He hadn't had a drink of hard liquor in about 10 years, not since he and Melissa had decided it wasn't for them, but he needed something tonight to calm the storm in his head. Melissa was in the living room reading a book when he walked in, and she glanced at him briefly. "You're late," she said, without looking up from the pages. "Is dinner in the fridge? Should I heat it up?" "Not hungry," Ted replied, trying to keep his voice even, and walked into the kitchen. He set the bottle of bourbon on the table, next to the bowl of fruit Melissa always kept in the center to make the house feel homey. The bottle looked out of place among the apples and oranges, like his thoughts among his everyday life. He didn't open it right away, just watched the light from the lamp reflect off the dark glass. Melissa walked into the kitchen, noticed the bottle, and raised her eyebrows. "Bourbon?" she asked with a slight smile. "Is this some kind of occasion?" "I just felt like it," he answered without looking at her. "I'll go to my office and work." She nodded without asking questions and went back to her book. Ted took the bottle and glass and went up to the second floor to his small office, where the evidence of his search had already accumulated. A notebook with notes, a photo of Melissa with the man named David, his wife's old diary. He closed the door, sat down at the table, and poured the bourbon into a glass, but he didn't drink it. He simply held it in his hand, feeling the coolness of the glass, and looked at the walls where there were diplomas, family photos, and a couple of drawings William had made as a child. One of them was of their family: Ted, Melissa, Brad, Mary, and little William, holding hands in the bright sun. Ted looked at that drawing and thought, "Brad isn't mine. What about the others? What will the tests show?" He waited for the night, as if the darkness might bring clarity. It was quiet outside, except for the occasional car that passed, its headlights flickering on the ceiling. Ted opened his laptop and logged back into the results site, checking to see if he had made a mistake, if he had missed something. But the data was the same. Not a single marker matched. He closed the page and began flipping through the family album he had brought from the living room. In each picture, he looked for Brad, trying to understand how he had not noticed that this boy, this young man, was not his. Brad was tall like Ted, with a straight nose and a stubborn chin, but Ted could see now that his eyes were different blue, like Melissa's, but with a different tint. He remembered Mary asking about her blue eyes once, and now the question seemed to him like a harbinger of a truth he did not want to see. Ted took a sip of bourbon, and the taste burned his throat, reminding him of college parties, when he and Melissa were young and anything seemed possible. He thought about how they had met. She as a nurse, he as an appendicitis patient, and her concern, her soft voice, had won him over. They had married quickly, within a year, and he had never doubted her. Even when Mary was born 7 months after their wedding, he had believed the story of the prematurity. Even when Brad and William showed up after her trips, he hadn't questioned it. He had trusted me. And now that trust had been shattered, and he felt like a fool for living in an illusion for 25 years. He stood up, went to the window, and looked out at the backyard, where the grass was still uncut despite his promise to do so. He thought of Brad, who was in Chicago now, building a career at an engineering firm, calling once a week to tell him about his life. Ted had always been proud of him, considered him an extension of himself, but now that pride was poisoned. He didn't know how to look at his son, how to talk to him without showing pain. He thought of Melissa. Did she know Brad wasn't his? Did she know he was infertile? Or was she just taking advantage of the moment to start the family they both wanted? These questions burned in him. but he couldn't ask them out loud. It wasn't time yet. Ted returned to the table and poured himself another bourbon, but still didn't drink it. He opened the notebook where he'd written down David's name from Linda's old Facebook posts and began searching for him online. He typed in David, Wisconsin, 1997, and scrolled through the results, but found nothing concrete. Then he added Linda Carter Farm and came across an old post in a local Wisconsin group that mentioned a David Holt who'd helped renovate the Carter Farm barn in the late 90s. Ted wrote down the name and tried to find his profile, but all he found was an abandoned page, last updated in 2015. The profile picture was of a middle-aged man with graying hair, but his features resembled the one in the photo. Ted zoomed in, trying to see if there was anything Brad said about David, but it was no use, too much time had passed. He put the notebook down and looked at the clock. Midnight. The house was quiet, Melissa was long asleep, and Ted felt more alone than ever. He thought about the moral choice he faced. Tell Melissa about the test, demand the truth, or keep quiet until Mary and William's results came back. He was afraid that they wouldn't be his either, and then his whole life, all the memories of family dinners, vacations, Christmas mornings, would turn into a lie. But he was also afraid that the truth would destroy not only him but his children as well. Brad was an adult, but how would he take it that Ted wasn't his father? Mary, with her wedding on the horizon, would she be able to cope with such a blow? And William, still a teenager, how would he cope if his world came crashing down? Ted stood up, picked up the bottle, and hid it in a drawer, deciding that alcohol wouldn't help. He lay down on the couch in his office, fully dressed, and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw the children's faces, their smiles, their voices, and each image was accompanied by the question, "Who's your father?" He thought about Melissa, how she had looked that morning, making pancakes, humming an old song, and how he had looked at her, searching for signs of guilt, but saw only the wife he loved. He thought about social expectations. In their circle, among their church friends, family was sacred and divorce was rare. But how to live with that truth, and how to live without it? In the morning, he woke up with a pain in his neck and a feeling that nothing had changed, but everything had gotten worse. He went down to the kitchen where Melissa was already making coffee, and her smile, so familiar, now seemed like a mask to him. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, pouring him a cup. "Not really," he answered, and it was true. She looked at him with mild concern, but didn't press the issue. Ted sipped his coffee, listening to her talk about her plans for the day, a trip to the garden center, a call to Mary to discuss the wedding dress. He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the next step, waiting for the results on Mary and William, finding David Holt, maybe talking to Linda. He knew that each step brought him closer to the truth, but also closer to the edge beyond which his family might cease to exist. He looked at the walls of their house, at the photographs, at the traces of their lives, and felt that they no longer belonged to him. But he said nothing, because it was too soon to speak, and the truth was too hard. Ted Miller sat in the basement of their house late on a Thursday night, surrounded by the smell of damp and old things that hadn't been touched in years. The light from the single overhead light cast long shadows across shelves piled high with boxes, tools, and the Christmas decorations that Melissa carefully stacked every January. He had been living in suspense for a week, ever since the DNA results that confirmed that Brad was not his son. The knowledge lay like a rock inside him, heavy and unmoving, but he couldn't stop. He waited for the results on Mary and William, but the wait was excruciating, and he kept digging through the past like an archaeologist searching for the pieces of his shattered life. Today, he decided to unpack another box, labeled 1996-1998, hoping to find something that might provide answers, though each new clue only pulled him deeper into doubt. The box was heavy, and Ted dragged it out to the middle of the basement, sitting down on an old stool. Inside were old bills, letters, a few tapes of movies they'd watched in the early years of their marriage, and a stack of photographs tied with a faded ribbon. He untied the knot and began flipping through the pictures, most of which were familiar. Their wedding, their first months in their new apartment, Melissa out with her friends. But one photo stopped him in his tracks. It was a party, apparently at the hospital where Melissa worked as a nurse. People in scrubs and party hats were laughing and holding plastic cups. Melissa was sitting at a table, her hair loose and her smile wider than Ted was used to. Next to her, too close, sat a man in a white coat with short dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His arm was on the back of her chair, and he was looking at her with a warmth that Ted didn't think was right. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in ballpoint pen, Christmas 1997, St. Joseph's Hospital, Melissa and Randy. Randy. The name hit Ted like a flash. He knew the man, Dr. Randy Clemens, the surgeon Melissa had worked with back then. Ted had met him a couple of times at hospital events where he had been invited as Melissa's husband. Randy was charming, with an easy smile and a way of speaking that made people feel special. Ted had never thought much of it, thinking of him as just a colleague, but now, looking at the photograph, he saw more. The way Melissa leaned toward him, the way their shoulders almost touched, the way her eyes sparkled. He set the photograph in his lap and closed his eyes, trying to remember that time. In 1997, a few months before their wedding, Ted went away for a week to summer camp with the students from the school where he was then teaching history. It was an annual trip for high school students to study the nature and history of Michigan. He remembered Melissa encouraging him, telling him it was a great opportunity and promising to meet him for dinner when he returned. He hadn't thought about what she had done in his absence because he trusted her. But now he remembered that the hospital Christmas party had been on the same days he was out of town. He returned a week later, tired but happy, and Melissa was the same as always caring, loving. 2 months later, she announced that she was pregnant with Mary. Ted stood up, his blood pounding in his temples, and walked up to his office on the second floor, taking the photograph with him. There, among his papers, he kept the old 1997 calendar he had found in a box a few days earlier. He used it to plan lectures and trips, and Melissa sometimes made notes in it. Ted opened the calendar for December and found the week he had been at camp, December 15th to 22nd. On December 17th, the date was crossed out, circled in red pen, with no explanation. Ted did the math in his head. Mary was born on February 15th, 1998. If conception had occurred in mid-December, that was exactly 9 months. Not 7, as the doctors had said, citing prematurity, but 9. A full-term pregnancy. Everything suddenly fell into place, and Ted felt like the floor was slipping out from under his feet. He sat down in a chair, calendar in hand, and looked at the picture of Melissa and Randy Clemens. Ted remembered how he was always the center of attention at hospital events, how the women on the ward joked about his charm. He remembered Melissa once mentioning that Randy had helped her with a difficult patient, her voice full of gratitude. Ted hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now every detail seemed like evidence. He thought of Mary, her blue eyes, which she herself had once questioned, her blonde hair, which was different from Melissa's dark locks and Ted's chestnut. Randy, as he remembered, was blonde. Was that a coincidence or an answer? Ted put the calendar and the photo in a drawer, next to the bottle of bourbon he hadn't finished since the night he found out about Brad. He didn't want to drink tonight. He needed a clear head to figure out what to do next. He went down to the living room, where Melissa was watching TV, cuddled up on the couch with a cup of herbal tea. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and she looked the same as ever calm Homie, his wife. But now he looked at her and saw a stranger, a woman who might have kept secrets their entire lives together. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "You look pale." "Just tired," he said, as he had become accustomed to, and sat down in the chair across from her, pretending to watch television. An old movie was playing, but Ted couldn't hear the words. His mind was on Randy Clemens, the party, the crossed-out date. He tried to remember if Melissa had mentioned Randy after that year, but only fragments came back. She said he'd left the hospital, moved to another state, I think. Ted had never bothered to ask, because it hadn't seemed important. Now he wished he'd paid closer attention. He got up and said he was going to bed, even though he knew sleep would not come. In his bedroom, he lay down, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how his life, so familiar, was now falling apart. He remembered Mary as a child, running around the house in her daisy dress, singing at school concerts, hugging him before leaving for college. He had always considered her his daughter, his first, his pride. But what if she was Randy's daughter? What if William, like Brad, wasn't his? Ted felt his heart clench at the thought, but he couldn't stop the questions from pouring out. He thought about Melissa. How could she keep quiet? Did she know about his infertility? Or was she just living as if nothing had happened, taking his love for granted? The next day, Ted decided to continue his search. He couldn't wait for Mary and William's test results without doing anything. He opened his laptop again and started searching for Randy Clemens. There was little information on the internet. An old profile on the website of the hospital where he worked until 1998, a few mentions in the local news about his involvement in charity events. Ted found his profile on LinkedIn. Randy now lived in California, worked in a private clinic, was married, had 2 daughters. His photo showed a man in his 50s with gray hair and the same charming smile. Ted enlarged the photo, trying to find Mary's features in it, but it was useless. Too much time had passed, and he didn't know what he was looking for. He decided to text Melissa's friend Linda Carter, whose Wisconsin farm had come up in his search. He found her on Facebook and sent her a message, trying to sound neutral. "Hi Linda, this is Ted, Melissa's husband. I'm trying to catch up on old times. Do you remember who was at that hospital Christmas party in 1997? I came across a picture, and I'm trying to figure out who was there." He sent the message and closed his laptop, his hands shaking. It was a risk Linda might tell Melissa, but Ted hoped she'd respond without giving details. That evening, Melissa suggested going to Mary's to discuss the wedding details, but Ted declined, citing work. He couldn't look at Mary without thinking about Randy, about the crossed-out date, about the photograph of Melissa smiling too brightly. He stayed home in his office and opened the calendar again, checking other dates. He found another entry, a year before Brad was born, when Melissa had visited her sister in Cleveland. There was a crossed-out date there, too, and Ted counted. 9 months again. He felt his throat tighten and reached for the bourbon, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he picked up the photograph of Mary from her graduation and stared at it for a long time, trying to find himself in her face, but all he saw were questions. Linda responded the next morning. Her message was short. "Oh, Ted, that's so nice to hear. There were a lot of people at that party, but I remember Melissa, Randy Clemens, a couple of the other nurses. It was a fun time. I can look for old photos if you want." Ted read it and felt his pulse quicken. Linda confirmed that Randy had been there. He wrote back, thanking her and asking for photos if he could find any, but his mind was already on something else. He remembered Melissa once saying that Randy had been a good friend at work, but that they had lost touch. Now that sounded like a lie. Ted decided to go to the library, where they kept old archives of local newspapers. He wanted to find something about Randy, about his life in 1997. The library was quiet, with only a few students sitting at tables, and Ted asked for access to the microfilms for 1997-1998. He leafed through the articles until he found an article about St. Joseph's Hospital that mentioned Randy Clemens as one of the best surgeons of the year. The article had his picture in it, and Ted saw the same smile again, the same blonde hair. He made a copy of the article and put it in a folder, which he now carried with him like a detective collecting evidence. At home, he continued to pretend that everything was fine. Melissa noticed his detachment, but chalked it up to exhaustion from work. She cooked dinner, singing in the kitchen, and Ted watched her, trying to understand how she could be so calm if the truth about Mary, about Brad, about anyone, was real. He thought about the moral dilemmas. If he found out that Mary and William weren't his either, could he stay? Could he forgive? He thought about social expectations, about how their friends, their church, their children would look at him if the truth came out. But most of all, he thought about love, the love he had with Melissa, the love he had with the children, and how that love now seemed as fragile as glass about to shatter. By the end of the week, Ted had received another text from Linda, a photograph from the same party, with Melissa and Randy dancing, their hands intertwined, her head on his shoulder. Ted looked at the picture, and all the questions he had asked himself came together. How could I not have seen? He put the picture in a drawer next to his calendar and decided to wait for the test results on Mary and William. But now, with each passing day, he felt his life, his family, his past, dissolving like dust in an old file he had opened too late. Ted Miller sat at the dining room table in their cozy dining room, the light from the old chandelier reflecting off the polished surface and casting a warm glow on the white tablecloth. It was a rare evening when the whole family was together. Melissa was carving a roast chicken, William, their youngest, was lazily picking at mashed potatoes, and Mary, beaming with happiness, was talking about her wedding plans. Brad, who was visiting from Chicago for the weekend, sat across from Ted, laughing at Mary's joke about how her fiancé, Paul, had almost ruined their engagement by dropping their ring in the grass. Melissa smiled as she added details about the time she and Mary had gone dress shopping and how she had nearly cried when she saw her daughter in white. The table was full of food and laughter and the familiar warmth of family, but for Ted, the evening was like a scene from someone else's life, in which he was an unwitting actor. He looked at Mary, her blonde hair pulled back into a high bun, her eyes bright with excitement as she described the floral arrangements for the wedding. "We want lilies, but Paul insists on roses. Can you believe that?" she said, and William rolled his eyes, muttering something about floral drama. Everyone laughed, even Melissa, who usually kept the table tidy. Ted tried to smile, but his lips barely moved. The other truth was ringing in his head, the one he'd been carrying around since Brad's DNA results and the photo of Melissa with Randy Clemens. He looked at Mary and thought, "You don't even know that I might not be your father, but I still remember the first time you said, 'Daddy,' holding my finger, when you were a year and a half." That moment, so clear in his memory, now seemed as fragile as glass ready to shatter under the weight of the truth. Ted looked down at his plate, where the chicken and mashed potatoes were almost untouched. He felt out of place in this house, among these people he loved more than anything else in the world. Melissa, sitting next to him, touched his arm as the salad bowl passed, and her fingers lingered on his wrist a little too long. "Ted, you're quiet today," she said with a small smile. "Is everything okay?" He nodded, muttering, "Just tired," and pushed his plate away. Mary looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly, but she quickly went back to her story about Paul trying to learn to waltz for their first dance. Brad joined in, joking that Paul must have stepped on all his feet in the dance studio, and the table filled with laughter again. Ted listened to their voices, but they came to him as if through thick glass. He looked at Mary, at her animated face, and saw in her the little girl who had run to him with drawings from kindergarten, calling him Daddy with such certainty that he had never doubted their connection. Now he thought of the crossed-out date on the calendar from 1997 of Randy Clemens, of the way Melissa had smiled at that hospital Christmas party. He thought of Brad, sitting across from him, unaware that Ted knew the truth. He was not his son. And William? Ted glanced at the younger boy, who was now scrolling through his phone, ignoring the conversation. What would the tests show on him and Mary? Ted felt his heart clench at the thought, but he couldn't give himself away, couldn't let his family see the cracks that were already spreading inside him. Melissa began to tell him how she and Mary had found the perfect wedding venue, an old barn converted into a ballroom, with exposed beams and a view of the lake. "It's going to be so beautiful, Ted, you have to see it," she said, looking at him with enthusiasm. "Mary and I have already chosen the menu, but I want you to see it too." Ted nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He imagined walking Mary down the aisle, everyone looking at them, smiling at himself, knowing that he probably didn't have the right to call her his daughter. He remembered her as a child, climbing into his lap while he read to her, her little arms wrapped around his neck. Those memories were real, but now they felt stolen, as if they belonged to someone else. As dinner went on, the conversation turned to memories. Brad told a story about how he and Mary had once been on a family vacation in Michigan, trying to catch fish, but only ended up tangling their lines, and Ted had to laugh and untangle them in knee-deep water. "You said we were the worst fishermen in the world," Brad said, smiling at Ted. But you still put up with us. Ted forced himself to smile back, but something inside him pricked. He remembered that day, the children's laughter, the smell of the lake, the warmth of the sun. He had felt like a father then, a real one, no doubt about it. Now he looked at Brad and thought, "You're not mine, but I still taught you how to hold a fishing rod." Mary chimed in, remembering how Ted had once made her a bee costume for a school play, and how proud she had been when everyone applauded. "Dad, you were the best," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Paul could never make anything like that." Everyone laughed again, but Ted felt his throat tighten. He wanted to respond, to say something that would make the moment work, but the words stuck. Instead, he just nodded and took a sip of water, hoping no one would notice his hands shaking slightly. William looked up from his phone and suddenly asked, "Dad, will you come to the concert with me next week? I got tickets to see that band you like." Ted looked at him, at his dark hair falling in his eyes, and tried to remember if there was anything of him in him. He wanted to say yes, wanted to be the kind of dad who took his son to concerts, but instead he muttered, "We'll see, Will. I have a lot of work." William shrugged, but Ted saw a hint of disappointment in his eyes, and it only made him feel more guilty. Melissa, as if sensing the tension, changed the subject, talking about how important it was for everyone to be at Mary's wedding, and how she wanted it to be a special day. "Ted, you're going to walk her down the aisle, aren't you?" she said, smiling. "It's going to be such a moment." Ted looked at her familiar face, at the lines around her eyes that had formed over the years of their marriage, and thought, "Do you know that I know? Do you know that I'm digging up the past?" He nodded, not trusting his voice, and said, "Of course, Mel." But inside, he was somewhere else. He was thinking about the photo of Melissa with Randy Clemens, the crossed-out date on the calendar, the DNA test that had shown Brad wasn't his. He was thinking about Mary, how her birth had coincided with that Christmas party when he'd been at camp with the students. He was thinking about Randy, his smile, the way he'd looked at Melissa in that photo, and David Holt, whose name had come up in connection with Melissa's trip to the farm in Wisconsin when Brad was conceived. And William? Who was his father? Ted felt his mind drowning in these questions, and every laugh at the table, every look from his children, only pulled him deeper into the darkness. He couldn't sit there any longer, pretending everything was okay. Ted pushed back his chair, stood up, and said, "Sorry, I'm tired. I'm going to lie down." Melissa looked at him with mild surprise, but nodded. "Rest, dear," she said. "Tomorrow is another day." Mary and Brad exchanged glances but said nothing, and William went back to his phone. Ted walked out of the dining room, feeling their eyes on his back, and went up to his office, closing the door. There, alone, he sat at his desk and pulled out the graduation photograph of Mary that he kept in a drawer. He looked at her smile, her blue eyes, and remembered the first time she said, "Daddy," running to him after school, confiding her secrets in him. He thought that even if she wasn't his biological daughter, those moments had been real. But the truth he now knew poisoned them. He opened the drawer to reveal the calendar, the photo of Melissa with Randy, the notes about David Holt. He added another entry in his notebook. "Mary, December 17th, 1997, Randy Clemens." Ted leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling, where the shadows from the streetlight danced in the darkness. He thought about the moral choice he faced: tell Melissa what he knew, or keep quiet until the test results came back for Mary and William. He thought about family responsibilities, how he had always been the father who fixed bikes, made suits, went to concerts. But now he felt like an outsider in that role. He thought about social expectations. Their friends, their church, their perfect family, all of it could crumble if the truth came out. But most of all, he thought about love, the love he had with Mary, with Brad, with William, and whether that love could withstand the truth. He didn't go back down to his family, didn't join in their laughter, didn't help clear the table. He stayed in the office, in a silence that was louder than any conversation. He waited for the night, waited for results, waited for the moment when he could understand who he was now: a father, a husband, or simply a man whose life had been a lie. Ted Miller stood in the kitchen, watching Melissa peel potatoes for dinner. A light rain fell outside, thin streams of water coating the glass, reflecting the dim light of the streetlights. It was Friday, and the house was quiet. William was away at a friend's, Brad was back in Chicago, and Mary was busy with wedding preparations. Ted had been waiting for this moment all week, ever since he'd gotten the DNA results for Mary, confirming that she, like Brad, was not his daughter. William's results were still being processed, but Ted could no longer keep quiet. The truth, he'd been piecing together the photographs, the crossed-out dates on the calendar, the name Randy Clemens, the name David Holt had become too much to bear. He knew this conversation would change everything, but he could no longer pretend that their lives were the cozy picture they presented to the world. He walked over to the table where the bowl of potato peelings sat, and his shadow fell across the countertop, causing Melissa to look up. She smiled, but it quickly faded when she noticed his face tense, with his lips pressed tightly together and his eyes that lacked their usual warmth. "Ted, is something wrong?" she asked, putting down the knife and wiping her hands on her apron. Her voice was soft, but there was a wariness to it, as if she already knew this conversation would not be easy. Ted took a deep breath, feeling the air catch in his throat. He had rehearsed these words in his head dozens of times, but now, standing before her, he felt vulnerable, as if the words could destroy not only their marriage, but himself as well. He looked her straight in the eyes, those familiar blue eyes he had loved for so many years, and said, "I know. Everything." Melissa froze. Her hands, still damp from the potato, hung in the air, and her face was paler than usual. She was silent, and the silence was louder than any words. Ted waited, feeling the seconds dragging by, as if time had slowed. He saw her eyes darting around, as if she were searching for something to say but couldn't find the words. Finally, she lowered her hands and asked quietly, "What do you know, Ted?" "Brad isn't my son," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Neither is Mary. I did the DNA tests, and I know about Randy Clemens, about David Holt, about that Christmas party in 1997, about Linda's farm. I found the photos, the records, the dates. I know everything, Melissa." Her face changed, as if someone had wiped all the color off it. She leaned against the countertop to steady herself, her fingers gripping the edge. She was silent for so long that Ted began to think she wouldn't answer. But then she nodded slowly, as if admitting defeat, and spoke, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I wanted children, Ted, and you couldn't. And I couldn't tell you, I was afraid you'd leave." The words hit him like a hammer. He knew they had tried to have children in the early years of their marriage, but the doctors had said he was the problem. He remembered how hard it had been for Melissa, how she would cry at night when she thought he was asleep. He remembered how they had discussed adoption, but she had always wanted her own children and wanted to be a mother. He thought they had gotten through this together, that their love was stronger. But now he saw that she had made choices he hadn't known about. "I would have stayed," he said, his voice breaking. "If you told me the truth, I would have stayed, but maybe with a different choice. Not a lie, Mel, not this." Melissa looked down, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her apron. She looked older than usual, as if the years of their marriage had suddenly weighed on her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was full of pain, but there was no apology in it. "You were a better father than any of those men. That's all you deserve, Ted. I just gave birth. You gave them everything: love, a home, a family. They're your children, even if they're not by blood. I never wanted you to know, because I was afraid it would ruin everything we built." Ted felt his throat tighten. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask how she could lie for so long, how she could look him in the eye when she knew Brad and Mary weren't his. But instead he asked, "And William? He's not mine either." Melissa looked up, her eyes a mixture of guilt and relief. "William is yours," she said quietly. "I found out I was pregnant after we were together. I wasn't sure, but the doctors confirmed the due date. He's yours, Ted." It should have been a relief, but instead Ted felt only emptiness. William was his, but Brad and Mary were not. Two of the three children he had raised, loved, considered his own, belonged to other men. He thought of Randy Clemens, smiling in the photograph from that Christmas party. He thought of David Holt, the farm in Wisconsin, the way Melissa had laughed in the picture, standing next to him. He wanted to ask if she had loved them, if these men had been more than a means to an end to her, but he could not bring himself to ask. Instead, he said, "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you make me live this lie?" Melissa walked toward him, her steps hesitant, as if she was afraid he would push her away. She stopped a step away from him, her hands shaking, but she didn't try to touch him. "I was afraid, Ted," she said, her voice breaking. "I knew you wanted a family as much as I did, but every time we tried, the doctors said it was impossible. I saw how you blamed yourself, how it broke you. I couldn't tell you I'd found another way because I was afraid you wouldn't forgive me. I thought that if we had children, if we were a family, that would make us happy. And we were, Ted, weren't we?" He looked at her face, which he knew better than his own, and felt his anger mingle with pain. Yes, they were happy. He remembered Christmas mornings when children had screamed as they unwrapped presents, trips to the lake where he and Brad had fished, evenings when Mary had sung at school concerts and William had drawn his first pictures. These moments had been real, but now they seemed stolen, as if he were living someone else's life. "You stole my choice, Mel," he said, his voice colder than he'd expected. "You decided for me, for us. You made me love children who weren't mine, and now I don't know who I am." Melissa closed her eyes, and Ted saw a tear roll down her cheek. She didn't try to wipe it away, just stood there, as if accepting his words as punishment. When she spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. "I know what I did was wrong, but I don't regret it, Ted. I don't regret it because we have Brad, Mary, William. They are our family. You are their father, and that won't change even if you hate me." Ted turned away, unable to look at her. He went to the window, looking out at the rain, which was getting heavier, pounding the glass like his own thoughts. He thought about the moral dilemmas that had plagued him since the first test result. He thought about what it meant to be a father, the blood relationship, or the years spent together, raising, loving, sacrificing. He thought about Mary, who was about to be married, and how he had to walk her down the aisle, knowing that she might be Randy Clemens's daughter. He thought about Brad, who called him every week, unaware that Ted knew the truth. And about William, who Melissa said was his son, the only one who connected him to this family by blood. "Who are they?" he asked finally, without turning around. "Randy and David. What did they mean to you?" Melissa was silent for so long that Ted thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, and her voice was full of weariness. "Randy was. A mistake. It happened once, at that party. I was drunk, alone. You were at camp. I didn't love him, Ted. It was just a moment of weakness. And David, he was Linda's friend on the farm. I went there to escape after the doctors said we couldn't have children. He was kind to me, and I let myself drift. But it wasn't love. I only loved you. Always." Ted turned to look at her. Her face was open, vulnerable, and he could see that she was telling the truth, or at least the truth she believed. But that didn't ease his pain. He thought about how these men, Randy and David, had become part of their family without knowing it. He thought about how Melissa had carried that secret all these years, smiling at him, holding him, building a life with him. "You should have told me," he said. "Even if I left, you should have given me a chance to decide." "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "but I couldn't lose you, and I didn't want the kids to grow up without a father. You were the best, Ted. You are the best." He didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. He felt shattered, as if everything he knew about himself, about his life, had crumbled to dust. He thought about social expectations, about how their friends from church, their neighbors, their children looked at them as the perfect family. He thought about how this truth, if it came out, would destroy not only their marriage, but the lives of Brad, Mary, William. He thought about the love he had for Melissa and whether he could ever trust her again. "What now, Ted?" Melissa asked, her voice a mixture of fear and hope. "What do you want to do?" He looked at her, at the woman he had loved for more than 25 years, and he didn't know the answer. He wanted to leave, he wanted to stay, he wanted to scream, he wanted to be silent. He thought about Mary, getting ready for her wedding, about Brad, building his career, about William, just starting his adult life. He thought about how these children, regardless of blood, called him father, and he didn't know if that was enough to keep him going the way he had before. "I don't know, Mel," he said finally. "I don't know who we are now." She nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to go to him, didn't try to hug him. She just stood there, looking at him, as if waiting for him to say something else. But Ted turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with a bowl of potato peelings and a silence that was louder than any words. He went up to his office, closed the door, and sat down at his desk. There, in a drawer, was his evidence. Photographs, a calendar, notes about Randy and David. He pulled out the graduation photo of Mary and stared at it for a long time, remembering the first time she said, "Daddy." He thought about how, even if she wasn't his daughter by blood, she was his daughter in every other way, and he didn't know if that was enough to keep him going the way he had before. The light rain had stopped, and the quiet of the evening had settled over the house like a soft blanket, but inside there was no peace. The living room, usually filled with laughter and conversation, was now tense and silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Melissa sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her fingers intertwined nervously, betraying the excitement she was trying to hide. Ted stood at the window, looking out at the darkening yard, where a lantern cast a feeble glow on the wet grass. It had been a week since their conversation in the kitchen. When he had told her the truth, he had learned the truth about Brad, about Mary, about Randy Clemens, and David Holt. They had lived in the same house since then, but as strangers, exchanging only brief conversations about everyday matters. William, their youngest, had noticed the change, but attributed it to his father's weariness from work. Mary was too busy with the wedding to care, and Brad returned to Chicago, leaving Ted alone with his thoughts. Today, Melissa had insisted on talking. She had come into his office that evening as he was leafing through old notes, trying to find something that might give him clarity. "Ted, we need to talk," she said quietly but firmly. "We can't go on like this." He nodded without looking at her, and they went down to the living room, where they now sat separated not only by space, but by the years of lies Melissa had carried within her. Ted felt empty, as if someone had taken everything that made him alive. He looked at Melissa, at her familiar face, at the wrinkles he had once considered evidence of their life together, and tried to figure out who she was to him now. Melissa broke the silence first. Her voice was quiet, but there was a sense of strength in it, as if she had summoned all her courage to ask the question. "Were you happy with me?" Ted froze. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp, like a knife that could cut the last threads that connected them. He was silent for a long time, looking at his hands where they rested on the arm of his chair. Memories flashed through his mind. Their wedding, when Melissa had laughed and danced with him to an old song. Nights when they lay in bed planning the future. Mornings when the children ran through the house, filling it with noise and joy. He remembered how Melissa had supported him when he lost his job at school and thought he couldn't cope, how she had baked his favorite apple pie every birthday. These moments had been real, and in them he had been happy. But now they were poisoned by the truth. He had learned the truth that had changed everything. "Yes," he said finally, and his voice was hoarse, as if the words were scraping his throat. "I was happy, but not now." Melissa nodded, as if she had been expecting this answer. Her eyes were shining, but she was not crying. She sat up straight, as if bracing herself for the blow she already knew was coming. She took a deep breath and asked, "What are you going to do?" Ted turned away, looking out the window, where the streetlight was now casting long shadows across the lawn. He didn't know the answer. Ever since he'd learned the truth about Brad and Mary, his life had felt foreign to him, as if he'd woken up in a strange house, among strange people. He'd thought about leaving, about getting an apartment somewhere in the city, about starting over, but the thought terrified him. He'd imagined waking up alone, without the morning smell of the coffee Melissa always made, without the voices of his children, without their family dinners. But staying here, in this house, with Melissa, knowing she'd lied to him for over 20 years, wasn't any easier. He felt trapped, where every choice seemed wrong. "I don't know," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Maybe I'll live on my own. I need time, Mel. I can't be here pretending nothing's changed." She nodded, and this time her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked quickly to stop them. She looked at him as if trying to memorize his face, as if she feared this would be the last time they would speak like this, openly, without masks. She swallowed and asked, "And the children? Will you tell them?" Ted felt his heart tighten. He thought of Mary, her wedding, the way she looked at him and called him Daddy, unaware that he might not be her father. He thought of Brad, calling him, sharing his successes, unaware that Ted carried this secret with him. And of William, who Melissa had said was his son by blood, but even that seemed fragile now, as if the truth about the other children might poison that connection too. He didn't want to ruin their world. He knew how painful it was to learn that your life had been built on a lie. He didn't want them to feel the way he felt. "I won't tell," he said firmly. "Not yet. This is my pain, Mel, not theirs. They shouldn't have to suffer because of what you did." Melissa looked down, her hands curling into fists. She didn't argue, didn't try to justify herself. She just sat there, accepting his words as the punishment she deserved. Ted looked at her and saw not only the woman who had lied to him, but the one who had been there for all these years, who had raised their children, who had built their family, even if it had been built on deception. He hated her for lying, but he couldn't deny that part of him still loved her for those years, for those moments, for the life they had created together. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly. "I thought I was doing it for us, for the family. I thought if we had children, we'd be happy. And we were, Ted, weren't we?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about the laughs they'd had at family dinners, Mary singing at school concerts, Brad learning to ride a bike, William drawing pictures that Ted hung on the wall of his office. These memories were real, but they seemed distant to him now, as if they belonged to someone else. He thought about what it meant to be a father not by blood, but by love, by the time they'd spent together, by the sacrifices he'd made for them. But the truth he now knew made those memories bitter. "We were happy," he said finally, "but that doesn't justify the lies. You stole my choice, Mel. You made me live in an illusion." She nodded, and a tear finally rolled down her cheek. She didn't try to wipe it away, just looked at him, as if waiting for him to say something else that would give her hope. But Ted didn't know if he had hope. He thought about how he was going to live his life, with or without her, with or without the kids. He thought about Mary, who was getting married soon, and how he had to walk her down the aisle, knowing that she was Randy Clemens's daughter. He thought about Brad, who thought of him as his father, not knowing about David Holt, and about William, who might be his only real connection to this family. "I don't want to ruin their lives," he said, his voice firmer than he'd expected. "But I don't know if I can stay with you. Not now. I need time to figure out who I am without this lie." Melissa nodded, her lips trembling, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew this conversation wasn't the end, but a turning point after which their lives would never be the same. She stood up, her movements slow, as if each step required effort. She walked toward him, but stopped short, not daring to touch him. "I'll wait, Ted," she said. "If you decide to leave, I'll understand. But I want you to know I loved you, always, and I'm grateful for everything you did for us, for the children." Ted didn't answer. He looked at her, the woman who had been his wife for more than 25 years, and he didn't know if he felt anger or love or hurt or all of the above. He turned and walked out of the living room, leaving her alone in the dim light of the lamp. He went up to his office, where his evidence lay on the table, the photographs, the calendar, the notes about Randy and David. He pulled out the picture of Mary from her graduation and looked at it for a long time, remembering the first time she said, "Daddy." He thought of Brad, the calls, the smile. He thought of William, the drawings he made, the request he made to go to the concert. These children were his family, regardless of blood, but the truth about Melissa, the choices she made it as fragile as glass. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began searching for apartments in the city. He wasn't sure he'd leave, but he needed something that would give him a sense of control, a sense that he could make a choice, something he hadn't had in years. He looked at the ads, but his thoughts kept returning to his children, to their laughter at dinner, to their trust. He knew he wouldn't tell them the truth, not now, maybe never. This was his pain, his burden, and he didn't want to put it on them. Ted closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling where the shadows from the lantern danced in the darkness. He thought about social expectations, about how their friends from church, their neighbors, their children saw them as the perfect family. He thought about moral dilemmas, about what it meant to be a father, a husband, a human being. He thought about the love he had for Melissa, for his children, and whether that love would be enough to survive betrayal. He didn't know the answer, but he knew he had to find it for himself, for them, for who he was now. The wind blew dry leaves across the gravel as Ted Miller unloaded a bag from his car in the driveway of his old friend Pete's summer home. The Wisconsin sky was gray, with heavy clouds that seemed to reflect his inner state. It had been a month since that conversation in the living room when Melissa had asked him if he was happy, and Ted had said he didn't know who they were to each other anymore. He couldn't stay in a house where every corner was a reminder of a lie, but he couldn't leave forever without figuring out what he wanted. Pete, a college friend, had offered his lake house, a small wooden cabin with battered furniture and a view of the water, where Ted could be by himself. Ted had accepted, not because he wanted solitude, but because he needed a place where he could breathe without Melissa's eyes on him. The cottage smelled of damp and pine, and Ted dropped his bag on the floor without unpacking it as he stepped inside. He sat down on the old, faded sofa and looked out the window, where the lake lay still as a mirror. He thought the solitude would give him clarity, but instead it only made the noise in his head worse. The DNA tests had confirmed that Brad and Mary were not his, and William, according to Melissa, was his, though the results were still pending. Ted didn't know if he believed her, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth about Brad and Mary had torn through his life like a knife cuts through fabric, and he didn't know how to sew it back together. He spent the first few days at the cottage just sitting on the porch, looking out at the water. Pete had left him a box of old books, but Ted couldn't read the words blurred, as if his mind refused to accept anything new. Instead, he began to sort through the letters and cards he had brought with him. Mary had sent him a handwritten letter, a rarity in the age of texts and phone calls. She wrote about the wedding, about her nerves before the ceremony, and thanked him for always being there. "Dad, I know you don't like sentimentality, but I'm so glad you're going to walk me down the aisle," she wrote. Ted read the lines several times, and each time his throat tightened. He remembered Mary, as a little girl, running to him with drawings, calling him Dad, with such certainty that he had never doubted their connection. Now he knew she might be Randy Clemens' daughter, but that didn't change how much he loved her. Brad sent a short message, which Ted printed out to keep with his other letters. "Dad, are you okay? You've been quiet lately. Call if you want to talk." Ted looked at those words and thought of Brad, his smile, the way he called every week to tell him about his job in Chicago. He wasn't his son by blood, but Ted remembered teaching him to ride a bike, sitting around a campfire on the lake, Brad looking at him with admiration. Those moments were real, and Ted couldn't deny them, even knowing the truth about David Holt. The most unexpected letter came from a granddaughter, Mary's daughter from her first marriage, which had ended in divorce before she had even met Paul. Kate, a 5-year-old with pigtails, had sent a drawing of the two of them, Ted with the beard he never wore, and her with a big red bow. Underneath the drawing, in childish handwriting, was written, "Best Grandpa." Ted held the piece of paper in his hands, his eyes stinging with tears. He had not been prepared for this, for how much this simple drawing would affect him. Kate had not known about the DNA tests, about Randy, about David, about Melissa's lies. To her, he was a grandfather who carried her on his shoulders and told her stories about pirates. And in that moment, Ted realized that his love for his children, for his granddaughter, was real, deep, not dependent on blood. He could not give her up, even if his heart was broken. but there was no love left for Melissa. He thought about her every day, remembering their wedding, their first years, her smile as she cooked dinner or sang in the kitchen. He loved her, but that love was now poisoned by betrayal. She had stolen his choice, forced him to live in an illusion, and he could not find his way back to the life where he trusted her unconditionally. He tried to imagine forgiving her, how they could continue to live together, but every time he thought of her, he saw pictures with Randy, with David, he saw crossed-out dates on the calendar. He heard her say, "I wanted children, and you couldn't." Those words were true, but they did not justify the lie. A month later, Ted came home. He didn't tell Melissa. He just pulled up to the house early in the morning, when the sun was just starting to break through the clouds. She was in the kitchen, making coffee, and when she saw him, she froze, holding the mug in her hands. Her eyes were full of hope and fear, but she said nothing, just watched him put his bag down in the hallway. "I'm back," he said, his voice even emotionless. "But I'll be sleeping in the guest room." Melissa nodded, her lips twitching, but she didn't argue. She knew this wasn't a reconciliation, but a compromise, his way of staying for the sake of the children, for the family he still considered his, despite everything. They didn't talk about the conversation in the living room, about her confession, about his pain. They simply existed, like two people who knew each other too well, but no longer knew how to be together. As the days went by, their lives settled into a strange new routine. Ted worked at college, came home, had dinner with Melissa and William, but their conversations were short, about the weather, about business, about Mary's wedding. Sometimes he and Melissa would sit together in the living room watching television like they used to, but now there was an invisible wall between them. They watched old movies they had once loved, but Ted didn't feel the warmth that had once filled those evenings. He watched the screen, but he was thinking about something else, about how his life, which he had thought of as a family, had turned out to be a sentence without a trial, a life sentence that he had to serve. One evening, while they were watching an old Western, Melissa turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you regret coming back?" Ted looked at her, her face lit by the blue light of the screen, and thought of the kids, of Kate, of the drawing that said, "Best grandpa ever." He thought of Mary calling to talk about the wedding, of Brad sending him a photo of a new project, of William still waiting for Ted to go to a concert with him. He didn't regret coming back because they were his family, even if they weren't by blood. But he couldn't go back to Melissa, not in the same way. "I came back for them," he said, his voice cold but honest. "Not for us." Melissa nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't try to argue. She turned back to the TV, and they continued watching the movie in silence, separated not only by the couch, but by the truth that lay between them. Ted lay down in the spare room, looking at the ceiling, where the shadows from the street lamp made a familiar pattern. He thought about what he had told himself when he returned. "I thought this was family, but this was a death sentence. No trial, life." He knew he would live for his children, for Kate, for the moments that made him a father, a grandfather, a man. But with Melissa, he could no longer be who he had been. Their love, once so strong, was now just a memory, and he didn't know if he had the strength to build something new on its ruins. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw the children's faces, their smiles, their voices, and the drawing of Kate he had pinned to the wall of his office. He knew that his love for them was real, and that it was the only thing keeping him in this house, in this life, in this sentence he had accepted without knowing how long he could bear it. The sun was filtering through the old maple trees that surrounded the barn Mary had chosen for her wedding. A gentle breeze rustled the white streamers strung along the wooden beams, and the guests gathered on the lawn talked, laughed, and raised champagne glasses. Ted stood by the window in the small preparation room, adjusting his tie in the mirror. His reflection looked familiar, the same man he saw every day, with a hint of gray in his hair, wrinkles that had deepened in recent months. But he was different inside, as if someone had taken out the part that made him whole and left only a shell. He could hear the music coming from outside, the soft chords of the violin Mary had chosen for the ceremony. She was there, in her white dress, with a smile that he knew would light up the day. Ted thought of her, his daughter, not his by blood, but his in every other way. He remembered the first time she said, "Daddy," running to him with her drawings, hugging him before she left for college. Those moments were real, and not even the truth about Randy Clemens could take them away. Today, he would walk her down the aisle, and he knew he would do it with pride, despite the pain that settled in his heart. Melissa was somewhere among the guests, wearing the blue dress she had chosen with such care, as if it might take them back to a time when their lives had seemed simple. They hadn't spoken of the past since that night in the living room when Ted had said he didn't know who they were anymore. He'd slept in the spare room, come home from work, had dinner with her and William, and watched television sometimes, but their conversations were empty, like echoes in an abandoned house. He didn't blame her out loud, didn't demand explanations, didn't seek revenge. He simply lived, day by day, trying to figure out who he was now, after all he had learned. The door opened and Mary walked in, her dress rustling on the wooden floor. She looked like something out of a dream, her blonde hair in soft curls, her eyes sparkling with excitement and happiness. "Are you ready, Dad?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. Ted turned, his lips stretching into a smile, the one he had honed over the years to hide his feelings. He looked at her, at his daughter, and felt something inside him tighten, not from pain, but from love that, despite everything, had remained unchanged. "Ready, honey," he said, holding out his hand. She took his elbow, and they walked out onto the lawn, where the guests had already gathered, and Paul waited at the altar, nervously adjusting his jacket. The music grew louder, and Ted led Mary down the aisle, aware of the eyes of friends, relatives, neighbors. He knew they saw him as a father, ushering his daughter into a new life, and he played the role because it was important to her, to all of them. When they reached the altar, Mary hugged him, whispering, "Thank you, Dad. I love you." Ted hugged her back, feeling his throat tighten, but he just nodded and stepped back, giving her hand to Paul. He returned to his seat, next to Melissa, who looked at him with cautious hope, but he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he looked at Mary, at her smile, at the way she beamed as she stood next to Paul. He was proud, truly proud, and that pride was stronger than the pain he carried inside. The ceremony passed quickly, like a dream, and soon the guests were dancing, laughing, toasting. Ted stood by the window, away from the crowd, holding a glass of water because he didn't want to drink. He looked at Mary dancing with Paul, at Brad joking with William, at Kate running between the tables with a red bow in her hair. He thought about the drawing she had given him that read, "Best Grandpa," and how those words had become an anchor for him in recent months. He didn't retaliate against Melissa, didn't blame her, didn't yell. He simply existed, waiting for something to begin to grow inside him again, hope, faith, meaning. Melissa walked toward him, her footsteps almost inaudible over the music. She stopped beside him, not touching him, and said softly, "She's happy, Ted. You did it for her." He nodded without looking at her and said, "We did." It was the first thing he'd said to her all day, and there was no warmth in the words, but there was no anger either. They were matter of fact, like he was stating the weather. Ted turned to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky gold and pink. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, next month, or next year. He didn't know if he would stay in this house, if he would continue to live with Melissa, if he would find the strength to forgive. But he knew he would be there for every birthday of Kate's, every phone call from Brad, every concert of William's. He would be a father, a grandfather, even if inside he no longer felt whole. And in that silence, amid the noise of the wedding, he waited. Not for revenge, not for answers, not for reconciliation. He waited for something to begin to grow inside him again slowly, imperceptibly, like the first shoots in spring, breaking through the frozen ground. He didn't know what it would be, but he was ready to wait. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.